The knock came at sunset, when the light turned the dusk gold, and the whole town of Larkspur Hollow smelled like wood smoke and cut hay. Clara Whitfield wiped flour from her hands and stood still for a moment, listening. Nobody knocked on the back door. Not for her. She opened it anyway. A man stood on the step with his hat in his hands. Dust clung to his boots. His shirt was patched at one elbow, sewn by someone who cared more about function than fashion. He didn't smile. He didn't look past her toward the parlor, where her sister usually sat by the window, waiting for exactly this kind of visitor. "Evening," he said. "I'm looking for Miss Whitfield." Clara's stomach dropped, the way it always did. "She's inside," Clara said, already stepping back to let him pass. "I'll get her." The man didn't move. "I meant you," he said. "You're Clara, aren't you? The one who fixed the Petersons' fence line without being asked." Nobody had ever come to the door for Clara. Larkspur Hollow was a small town built along a slow brown river, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business before it happened. The Whitfield house sat at the edge of town, a two-story clapboard place with a porch that sagged slightly on the left side, the way an old dog favors one leg. Clara was 24. Her hands were rough from years of garden work and mending harnesses for extra coin. Her hair was always coming loose from its pins by midday, no matter how carefully she set it that morning. She had a way of looking at people directly, without flinching, which some folks found unsettling in a woman. Her sister Rosalind was 22 and beautiful in the way that stopped conversations. Golden hair, eyes the color of the sky before rain, a laugh that carried across a room and made men forget what they'd been saying. Every Sunday, a line of buggies formed outside the Whitfield gate. Ranchers' sons, the banker's nephew, a traveling doctor who'd extended his stay in town by 3 weeks and counting. All of them came for Rosalind. Clara set the table for these visits. She poured the coffee. She sat quietly in the corner with her mending and watched men fall over themselves for a woman who barely noticed they existed. She had stopped minding, mostly, or she'd told herself she had. But some nights, after the last buggy pulled away and the house went quiet, Clara would stand at her bedroom window and watch the road disappear into darkness, and something in her chest would ache in a place she'd never named out loud. The man on the step introduced himself as Jed Cole. "Jed," he said. "Folks call me Jed." He'd bought the old Hargrove spread 6 miles north, the one that had sat empty for 2 years since Silas Hargrove passed. Nobody in town had met him yet. He kept to himself, came into town only for supplies, spoke to the shopkeepers in short sentences, and nothing more. "I heard you know cattle," Jed said. "Heard you helped your father run this place before he passed." Clara's throat tightened at the mention of her father. 2 years now, and it still caught her sideways sometimes. "I know cattle," she said carefully. "Why does that matter to you?" "I've got 80 head and no idea what I'm doing," Jed said. "I was a soldier before I was a rancher. I know how to survive a winter. I don't know how to keep a herd alive through one." He said it plainly, without shame, and something about that honesty caught Clara off guard. Men in town liked to pretend they knew everything. This one stood on her porch admitting he didn't. "I could pay you," Jed added, "for your time. Advice, mostly. Maybe some hands-on help if the calving goes poorly." Behind Clara, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Rosalind's voice, light and curious. "Clara? Who's at the door?" Jed's eyes didn't move toward the sound. They stayed on Clara. "I'll think on it," Clara said quietly. "That's fair," Jed said. He set his hat back on his head. "I'll come by Thursday. If the answer's no, I'll understand." He turned and walked toward a gray, gelding tied at the gate, and Clara watched him go, feeling strangely unsteady, as if the ground had shifted an inch beneath the porch boards. Rosalind appeared in the doorway, tucking a loose curl behind her ear, already scanning the yard for whatever gentleman caller she assumed had come. Who was that? Nobody important, Clara said, and immediately felt strange for saying it, though she couldn't say why. He looked important enough to make you go quiet, Rosalind said, studying her sister's face with the sharp attention she usually reserved for choosing ribbon at the dry goods store. What did he want? Cattle advice. Rosalind laughed, delighted. From you? Clara, that's wonderful. Finally, someone in this town who appreciates something other than a pretty face. She meant it kindly. Rosalind always meant things kindly. That was the maddening part. She never seemed to notice the weight her beauty put on the room, the way it swallowed every other woman standing near her, including her own sister. Clara went back to the kitchen and finished kneading the bread dough, working it harder than it needed, until her arms ached and her mind quieted. Thursday came gray and windy, storm clouds building over the western ridge. Clara had almost convinced herself Jed Cole wouldn't show, that she'd imagined the whole strange visit, when she heard hooves on the road just after 4 o'clock. He rode up without a wasted motion, dismounted, and waited at the gate rather than the door this time, as if he understood something about boundaries that most men in town never bothered to learn. Well, he asked. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and walked out to meet him. I'll come look at your herd Saturday, she said. No promises beyond that. Jed nodded once, like a man closing a deal he'd expected to close. I appreciate it, he said. Then, after a pause, your sister's a fine-looking woman. Whole town seems to think so. Clara's chest tightened, bracing for the familiar sting, the request to help arrange an introduction, the question about whether Rosalind preferred blue or green. She's a good person, too, Clara said a little defensively. I don't doubt it, Jed said, but I didn't ride 6 miles to ask about her. He touched the brim of his hat, turned, and rode off before Clara could think of anything to say. She stood at the gate a long time after he'd gone, watching the storm clouds roll closer, feeling something unfamiliar settle into her chest. Not quite hope. She wasn't foolish enough to call it that yet. But something. Saturday morning broke clear and cold. Clara rode north alone, telling her mother she was looking at a neighbor's cattle for advice money, which was true, though it didn't feel like the whole truth. The Hargrove place looked different than she remembered. The fences were mended, crooked in places but solid. A new roof sat half-finished on the barn. Someone had been working hard, alone, for longer hours than made sense for one man. Jed met her in the yard, sleeves rolled up, dirt on his forearms. Storm knocked down half my north fence, he said. Lost a few head before I found the gap. Clara walked the fence line with him in silence, noting the soil, the grass, the thinness of some of the cattle. She asked questions. He answered honestly, admitting what he didn't know without embarrassment, which was rarer in a man than Clara had realized until she stood beside one who did it easily. Near sunset, they stopped by the creek that cut through the eastern pasture. Jed crouched down, cupped water in his hands, and drank without ceremony. Can I ask you something? He said, not looking up. You can ask. Why does everyone in that town act like you're invisible? Clara's breath caught. I'm not invisible, she said. I'm just not. She stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence without sounding bitter. Not what? Not Rosalind. Jed stood, wiped his hands on his trousers, and looked at her directly, the way she looked at other people, and made them uncomfortable. Good, he said. I didn't ride out here looking for Rosalind. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain from somewhere far off. Clara felt her pulse in her throat. Then why did you ride out to my door? She asked. That first evening. Why me? Jed was quiet for a moment, studying the water instead of her face, like the answer cost him something to give. Because I saw you mending the Petersons' fence in the pouring rain 3 weeks ago, he said. Alone. Nobody asked you to. Nobody thanked you for it either, far as I could tell. You just did it because it needed doing. He finally looked up. "I've been alone a long time, Miss Whitfield," he said. "I know the difference between someone who wants to be seen and someone who's just used to not being." Clara didn't trust herself to speak. Behind them, thunder rolled low across the ridge, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall, dark circles spreading across the dry summer dust. Jed reached for his hat, then stopped, his hand hovering, his eyes still on hers. "There's something else," he said. "Something I should have told you before you rode all the way out here." Clara's heart went still. "What is it?" Jed opened his mouth to answer, and that was when they heard the second horse, coming hard and fast up the north road. A rider bent low over the saddle, shouting something Clara couldn't yet make out over the rising wind. The rider was Tom Ashby, one of the hands from the Petersons' place, and he nearly went off his horse pulling it to a stop in Jed's yard. "Fire!" Tom gasped, chest heaving. "Grass fire, north pasture, jump the creek bed. It's headed for the Whitfield place if the wind don't turn." Clara's blood went cold. Her mother was home. Rosalind was home. The house, the barn, everything her father had built before he died. All of it sat directly in the fire's path if the wind held from the west. She was already moving toward her horse before Tom finished speaking. "Clara," Jed caught her arm, just for a moment, just long enough to meet her eyes. "I'm coming. You don't have to." "I'm coming," he said again, like it wasn't a question worth asking twice. They rode hard through the gathering dark, rain spitting sideways now, the smell of smoke growing stronger with every mile. By the time they crested the last hill above town, the sky to the north glowed orange beneath the storm clouds, an ugly, flickering light that didn't belong in a world of rain. The fire had reached the Whitfield's back pasture. Flames moved low and fast through the dry grass, driven by wind that hadn't yet decided which way to turn. Neighbors were already there, beating at the flames with wet sacks and shovels, forming a ragged line between the fire and the barn. Clara saw her mother directing people with a calm, sharp voice, and relief loosened something in her chest. But Rosalind was nowhere in sight. "Where's my sister?" Clara shouted, sliding off her horse. Her mother's face went pale. "She went to get the milk cow. She said she'd be right back." That was 20 minutes ago. The milk cow was pastured near the creek, near where the fire had jumped. Clara didn't think. She ran. Smoke burned her eyes before she'd gone 100 yards. The world narrowed to heat and noise, the crackle of burning grass, the distant panicked lowing of cattle. She called Rosalind's name until her voice cracked. She found her sister near the creek bank, coughing, one ankle twisted beneath her where she'd fallen trying to lead the frightened cow through the smoke. The fire had circled wider than anyone expected, and now a wall of flame stood between them and the house, low but spreading fast toward the dry brush along the creek. "Clara," Rosalind's voice was raw with smoke and fear. "I can't put weight on it. I tried, I couldn't. I've got you." Clara knelt, got her sister's arm over her shoulders, and hauled her upright. The cow bolted on its own, crashing away through the smoke toward the water. They needed another way around. The direct path back to the house was gone, swallowed by fire that moved faster than either of them could run, especially with Rosalind's ankle useless beneath her. That was when Clara saw the shape moving through the smoke. Jed on foot now, his horse left behind, a wet blanket wrapped around his shoulders and another balled up in his fist. "This way," he shouted, pointing toward the shallow bend in the creek. "Water's low enough to cross there. Go now, both of you. I'll hold the gap." "Jed, come with us." "Go, Clara." There wasn't time to argue. Clara half-carried, half-dragged her sister toward the creek bend, the heat pressing against her back like something alive. She heard Jed behind them, beating at the low flames with the wet blanket, buying them the seconds they needed. They reached the water, stumbled across the shallow crossing, and collapsed on the far bank, coughing, soaked to the knees, alive. Clara turned back, searching the smoke for Jed's shape. He didn't come. Jed, she screamed his name until it tore something in her throat. For 3 long seconds, there was nothing but smoke and fire and the terrible absence of him. Then he stumbled through the gray wall of smoke, blankets smoldering at the edges, one sleeve torn and singed but upright. Alive. Clara didn't remember crossing the distance between them. She only remembered her hands gripping the front of his shirt, checking for burns, for blood, for anything that would explain the way her heart had stopped in her chest. "You're an idiot," she said, her voice breaking. "You could have died. Wasn't going to let the fire have you," Jed said quietly. "Either of you." Something passed between them then, wordless and enormous, and for a moment the fire and the smoke and the shouting neighbors seemed very far away. By midnight, the rain had finally won its argument with the wind, and the fire died into smoking black ribbons across the pasture. The barn stood. The house stood. Rosalind's ankle was wrapped and propped on a pillow in the parlor, and Clara's mother had already begun composing the story she'd tell at church on Sunday, the one where nobody quite understood how close they'd come to losing everything. Clara found Jed outside, sitting on the porch steps, staring at the smoldering field. "You said there was something you needed to tell me," she said, sitting beside him. Before Tom rode up, Jed was quiet for a long moment, turning his hat over in his hands. "I know your father," he said finally. "Knew him, I mean, before he passed." Clara went still. "You never mentioned that." "We served together," Jed said. "Same regiment back before either of us came west." He talked about this place all the time, about his daughters. A faint, sad smile crossed his face. "He talked about you more than you'd guess." "What did he say?" "He said his eldest kept the whole ranch running while everyone fussed over the youngest," Jed said. "Said it wasn't fair, but he didn't know how to fix it before he ran out of time to try." Clara's eyes stung, and it had nothing to do with smoke. "He wrote me a letter," Jed continued, "near the end. Asked me to look in on you both if I ever settled anywhere close. I didn't know he meant this close until I rode into Larkspur Hollow and heard the name Whitfield." He glanced at her. "I should have told you the first evening. I didn't know how, without it sounding like some kind of trick." Clara sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling somewhere between grief and something warmer. "So you came here because of a promise to my father," she said quietly. "Not because—" "I came here because of a promise," Jed said. "I stayed because of you. Those are 2 different things, Clara, and I need you to understand that before this goes any further." The rain had softened to a drizzle now, drumming gently on the porch roof. Somewhere inside, Clara could hear her mother's voice, and Rosalind's soft laughter, and the ordinary sounds of a house that had nearly burned and hadn't. "I don't know what to do with that," Clara admitted. "You don't have to do anything with it tonight," Jed said. "I'm not going anywhere. My herd's still 6 miles north, and it still needs someone who knows what she's doing." Clara almost smiled. "Almost. Thursday, then," she said. "I'll come look at the fence line you didn't finish." "Thursday," Jed agreed. He stood, settled his hat back on his head, wincing slightly at the burn along his forearm he hadn't mentioned to anyone yet, and walked toward his horse, disappearing into the drizzle and the dark. Clara sat alone on the porch a long while after he'd gone, watching the smoke rise thin and pale from the blackened field, thinking about her father's letter and a promise that had somehow become something else entirely. She didn't know yet that Rosalind had seen them from the parlor window. Didn't know that her sister had watched the whole quiet exchange with an expression nobody in Larkspur Hollow had ever seen on her before. Not admiration, not curiosity, but something closer to longing. And she didn't know that 3 days later, before Thursday ever came, a letter would arrive at the Whitfield house addressed not to her, but to Rosalind, in handwriting neither sister recognized. A letter that would change everything Clara thought she understood about the quiet cowboy who'd knocked on her door at sunset. The letter sat on the kitchen table for 2 days before anyone worked up the courage to open it. It arrived addressed to Miss Rosalind Whitfield in handwriting that leaned hard to the left, the ink smudged along one edge, as if the writer had cried while sealing it. Rosalind turned it over in her hands a dozen times, studying the postmark from a town in Missouri neither sister had ever visited. "I don't know anyone in Missouri," Rosalind said. "Open it," their mother said. "Standing there won't tell you anything." Rosalind opened it at the table, Clara sitting across from her, mending forgotten in her lap. She read in silence, her face shifting from confusion to something pale and troubled. "What is it?" Clara asked. Rosalind looked up slowly. "It's from a woman named Sarah Cole," she said. "She's asking if we know a man named Jedediah Cole. She says," Rosalind's voice faltered, "she says he's her husband, and he's 3 months behind on the money he sends her, and she's afraid something's happened to him." The kitchen went very quiet. Clara didn't sleep that night. She lay in the dark turning the words over, trying to make them fit the man who'd walked into a wall of fire to save her sister. The man who'd sat beside her on the porch and spoken of promises and honesty as though those words meant something sacred to him. A wife. A husband 3 months behind on money he sends her. By morning, Clara had convinced herself of 100 different explanations and believed none of them. She rode to the Hargrove place before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, the letter folded in her coat pocket like something that might burn a hole through the fabric if she carried it too long. Jed was in the yard, mending the same fence line the fire had scorched along its edge, and he straightened when he saw her coming, his expression shifting from welcome to concern. "Clara, what's wrong?" She didn't dismount right away. She sat on her horse and studied his face, searching it for guilt, for the flicker of a man caught in a lie. "Who is Sarah Cole?" she asked. Jed went very still. "Where did you hear that name?" "She wrote to my sister," Clara said, her voice shaking despite her effort to keep it steady. "Asking after her husband. Asking after money you apparently owe her." She pulled the letter from her pocket and held it out, her hand not quite steady. "Tell me it's a mistake, Jed. Tell me there's another Jedediah Cole in this territory." Jed took the letter, read it once, and closed his eyes. For a long moment, he said nothing at all, and Clara felt something inside her chest crack open, the way ice cracks on a pond before it gives way entirely. "Sarah's not my wife," Jed said finally. "She's my brother's." Clara's breath caught. "Your brother's?" "Daniel," Jed said, and his voice roughened around the name. "My younger brother. He died at Chickamauga 3 weeks before the letter reached me. Sarah was carrying his son when it happened. She's never once seen him, Clara. Never held him." He handed the letter back, his hand trembling slightly. "I send her what I can every month under my name because Daniel's pension got tangled up in paperwork that never got sorted, and she had a baby to feed and no husband to feed him. I never told her to stop calling me her husband in her letters. It made things simpler with the bank." "Why didn't you tell me?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because it's not a story I know how to tell without crying," Jed said, and for the first time since she'd met him, his composure slipped, just slightly, just enough for Clara to see the grief he carried quietly beneath the calm. "I lost my brother and gained a nephew I've never met, and every month I send money to a woman I've spoken to exactly twice, because it's the only thing left I can do for him." Clara slid down from her horse without quite deciding to, and crossed the yard, and put her arms around him before either of them had said another word. Jed held on to her like a man who hadn't let himself be held in a very long time. "I should have told you sooner," Jed said. Once they'd sat down on the porch steps, the morning light stretching long and gold across the yard. "About Daniel. About Sarah. I didn't want you to think less of me for keeping it quiet." "I don't think less of you," Clara said. "I think you're a man who keeps his grief the way he keeps everything else. Close. Private. like it's not allowed to take up room. Jed looked at her sideways. That obvious? Only to someone who does the same thing, Clara admitted. They sat together in comfortable silence, the kind that had grown between them slowly, the way trust always does when it's earned rather than assumed. I want to write to her, Clara said eventually. Sarah, I want to tell her the pension mix-up will get sorted, one way or another, even if I have to ride to the county office myself and shout until someone listens. Jed smiled, the first full smile Clara had seen from him, and it changed his whole face. I believe you would, he said. I want to meet your nephew someday too, Clara added. If that's something you'd want. It's exactly something I'd want, Jed said quietly. Back at the Whitfield house, Rosalind had spent the morning staring out the parlor window, turning something over in her own mind that had nothing to do with letters from Missouri. She'd seen the way Clara looked at Jed Cole. She'd seen, more importantly, the way Jed looked at Clara, steady, unwavering, the way no man had ever looked at Rosalind despite the crowd of buggies that gathered every Sunday at their gate. For the first time in her life, Rosalind understood, with an ache she hadn't expected, what it felt like to be looked past. It wasn't jealousy exactly. It was something quieter and more honest than that. A recognition that all the attention she'd received over the years had never once made her feel truly known, the way Clara seemed known by a man who'd only arrived in Larkspur Hollow a few weeks earlier. When Dr. Hensley called that afternoon, the traveling physician who'd extended his stay in town 3 weeks running, Rosalind found herself, for once, actually listening to what he said instead of simply enjoying being listened to. He talked about medicine, about the small mining town 2 counties over that badly needed a doctor and hadn't had one in 4 years, about how lonely that kind of work could be, and how he'd been putting off settling there because he hadn't yet found a reason worth staying anywhere. What would make it worth staying? Rosalind asked, and meant the question honestly for the first time in longer than she could remember. Dr. Hensley looked at her for a long moment, surprised, as if he wasn't used to being asked a real question by a woman he'd been courting for show. I don't know yet, he admitted, but I'd like to find out. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was a beginning build on something more solid than a pretty face across a parlor table. And Rosalind found she liked the shape of that far better than she'd expected to. Autumn came to Larkspur Hollow slowly, the cottonwoods along the creek turning gold, the fields cut and stacked and readied for winter. The scorched pasture behind the Whitfield house had begun to green again in patches, new grass pushing up stubborn and green through blackened earth, the way things do when given enough time and enough rain. Clara rode north most mornings now, not for cattle advice, though she still gave plenty of that, but because the ride itself had become something she looked forward to the way she'd once looked forward to nothing at all. Jed had finished the barn roof. He'd finished the fence line too, all of it sturdy and square, built to outlast whatever winter threw at it. On a cool October evening, with the sun sliding low and orange behind the western ridge, Jed met her at the gate the way he always did now, without ceremony, without performance, just a quiet certainty that had grown between them like the new grass in the burned field. I got a letter from Sarah, he said, handing it to her. She sorted the pension, took your advice, and rode to the county office herself. Said the clerk finally listened when a woman showed up too stubborn to leave without an answer. Clara laughed, real and warm. And the boy, she asked. Your nephew? She's bringing him out in the spring, Jed said. Wants him to know his father's family. Wants him to see the land Daniel used to write home about. You'll be a good uncle, Clara said. I'd like to be something else to him too, Jed said, and there was a weight in his voice that made Clara go still. A father, maybe if things go the way I'm hoping they will. If you're willing to have a ready-made family, Clara. A nephew who'll need raising, and a woman in Missouri who'll always be part of our lives, one way or another. Clara looked at him a long moment, the sunset light gold across his face, The same light that had been falling across the porch the evening he first knocked on her door, asking for a woman nobody had ever asked for before. "I've spent my whole life being the sister nobody knocked for," Clara said quietly. "I think I'd like to spend the rest of it being the one somebody chose." Jed reached for her hand and didn't let go. Winter came gently that year to Larkspur Hollow. The Whitfield porch, still sagging slightly on the left side, held 2 rocking chairs by December instead of 1. And in the evenings, as the light faded over the ridge, they rocked slowly side by side, unhurried, the way people do when they've finally stopped waiting for something and started simply living it. Come spring, a second knock arrived at that same back door, smaller this time, uncertain. A boy of 3 years old holding tight to his mother's hand, looking up at the wide sky and the green hills of a home he'd never seen before, but somehow, in the way children sometimes know these things, already understood was his. Jed knelt down in the yard to meet him at eye level, the same way he'd once stood quietly on a porch step, hat in his hands, asking for a woman nobody else had ever thought to ask for. And behind them, in the golden hush of another Larkspur Hollow sunset, 2 sets of footprints crossed the yard toward the house. One old and steady, one small and new, walking together toward a lantern already glowing warm inside the window.